welcome back to Thinking Readers, where children listen to stories and learn to think. Today is day 13 of our story advent calendar. Yesterday, we read the opening chapters of The Midnight Fox. We practiced our summarising skills, and we also looked at how the first-person narrator can be unreliable. We examined how the narrator uses language to show his changing feelings for animals. And I left you with a question. Does Tom's father know that he's crying? Did you find any evidence in the text to support your thinking either way? Who's joining us today? It is Horse. I shared my thoughts with Horse. I did think that Tom's father knew he was crying, but I couldn't find any hard and fast evidence from the text. I had to use my inference skills. So the clues were for me that Tom's nose was running, and he says that this happens when he gets upset. Being his father, he would know that about his son. Second of all, his eyes were wet. Third of all, his model aeroplane is a disaster. He's putting things in all the wrong places. And again, being his father, he would know that that's unlike Tom. Additionally, his father doesn't leave the room after Tom is crying. He doesn't leave the room. He stays. He lingers. And then he's gentle with him and tells him he's done a good job, and even goes as far as to suggest that he may be able to have a pig on the farm. So all those clues, plus my own experience of being a parent, supports my idea, I think, that Tom's father knew he was crying. What did you come up with? Did you have something opposite? I wonder what your thoughts were and what your evidence was, how you proved your thinking. Another deeper question might be, if Tom's father did know that he was crying, why doesn't he say anything? Why doesn't he acknowledge it? Why do you think Tom's father didn't say anything? Find a parent, pet or a toy and keep chatting about it. Our book today is The Wild Robot by Peter Brown. Let's have a look at the front cover and see if we can make our predictions about this story. Let's get reading. Chapter 1, The Ocean. Our story begins on the ocean, with wind and rain and thunder and lightning and waves. A hurricane roared and raged through the night. And in the middle of the chaos, a cargo ship was sinking down, down, down to the ocean floor. The ship left hundreds of crates floating on the surface. But as the hurricane thrashed and swirled and knocked them around, the crates also began sinking into the depths. One after another, they were swallowed up by the waves until only 5 crates remained. By morning, the hurricane was gone. There were no clouds, no ships, no land in sight. There was only calm water and clear skies, and those 5 crates lazily bobbing along on an ocean current. Days passed, and then a smudge of green appeared on the horizon. As the crates drifted closer, the soft green shapes slowly sharpened into the hard edges of a wild, rocky island. The first crate rode to shore on a tumbling, rumbling wave and then crashed against the rocks with such force that the whole thing burst apart. Now, reader, what I haven't mentioned is that tightly packed inside each crate was a brand new robot. The cargo ship had been transporting hundreds of them before it was swept up in the storm. Now only 5 robots were left. Actually, only 4 were left because that first crate crashed against the rocks and the robot inside was shattered to pieces. The same thing happened to the next crate. It crashed against the rocks and robot parts flew everywhere. Then it happened to the next crate and the next. Robot limbs and torsos were flung onto ledges. A robot head splashed into a tide pool. A robot foot skittered into the waves. And then came the last crate. It followed the same path as the others, but instead of crashing against the rocks, it sloshed against the remains of the first 4 crates. Soon, more waves were heaving it up out of the water. It soared through the air, spinning and glistening until it slammed down onto a tall shelf of rock. The crate was cracked and crumpled, but the robot inside was safe. Chapter 2. The Otters. The island's northern shore had become something of a robot gravesite. Scattered across the rocks were the broken bodies of 4 dead robots. They sparkled in the early morning light, and their sparkles caught the attention of some very curious creatures. A gang of sea otters was romping through the shallows when one of them noticed the sparkling objects. The otters all froze. They raised their noses to the wind, but they smelled only the sea, so they cautiously crept over the rocks to take a closer look. The gang slowly approached a robot torso. The biggest otter stuck out its paw, swatted the heavy thing, and jumped back. But nothing happened, so they wriggled over to a robot head. Another brave otter stuck out her paw and flipped the head over. It made a lovely clinking sound on the rocks, and the otters squeaked with delight. They spread out and played with robot arms and legs and feet. More hands were flipped. One of the otters discovered a robot head in a tide pool, and they all dove and took turns rolling it along the bottom. And then they spotted something else. Overlooking the gravesite was the one surviving crate. Its sides were scraped and dented, and a wide gash ran across its top. The otters scampered up the rocks and climbed onto the big box. 10 furry faces poked through the gash, eager to see what was inside. What they saw was another brand new robot. But this robot was different. It was still in one piece, and it was surrounded by spongy packing foam. The otters reached through the gash and tore at the foam. It was so soft and squishy. They squeaked as they snatched at the fluffy stuff. Shreds of it floated away on the sea breeze, and in all the excitement, one of their paws accidentally slapped an important little button on the back of the robot's head. Click. It took a while for the otters to realise that something was happening inside the crate, but a moment later they heard it, a low, whirring sound. Everyone stopped and stared, and then the robot opened her eyes. Chapter 3. The Robot. The robot's computer brain booted up. Her programs began coming online, and then, still packed in her crate, she automatically started to speak. Hello, I am Rosum Unit 7134, but you may call me Ros. While my robotic systems are activating, I will tell you about myself. Once fully activated, I will be able to move and communicate and learn. Simply give me a task and I will complete it. Over time, I will find better ways of completing my tasks. I will become a better robot. When I am not needed, I will stay out of the way and keep myself in good working order. Thank you for your time. I am now fully activated. Chapter 4. The Robot Hatches. As you might know, robots don't really feel emotions, not the way animals do. And yet, as she sat in her crumpled crate, Ros felt something like curiosity. She was curious about the warm ball of light shining down from above. So her computer brain went to work, and she identified the light. It was the sun. The robot felt her body absorbing the sun's energy. With each passing minute, she felt more awake. When her battery was good and full, Roz looked around and realised she was packed inside a crate. She tried to move her arms, but they were restrained by cords, so she applied some force. The motors in her arms hummed a little louder, and the cords snapped. Then she lifted her hands and pulled apart the crate. Like a hatchling breaking from its shell, Roz climbed out into the world. Chapter 5. The Robot Gravesite. Those otters were now hiding behind a rock, their round heads nervously poked up, and they watched as a sparkling monster emerged from the crate. The monster slowly turned her head as she scanned the coastline. Her head turned and turned, all the way around, and it didn't stop turning until she was looking right at the otters. "Hello, otters. My name is Roz." The robot's voice was simply too much for the skittish creatures. The biggest otter squeaked, and the whole gang suddenly took off. They galloped back across the robot gravesite, flopped into the ocean, and raced through the waves as fast as they could. Roz watched the otters go, but her eyes lingered on the sparkling objects that littered the shore. The objects looked strangely familiar. The robot swung her left leg forward, then her right, and just like that, she was taking her very first steps. She stomped away from her crate and over the rocks, through the gravesite, until she was standing above a broken robot body. She leaned in and noticed the word Rozum lightly etched on the torso. She noticed the same word on all torsos, including her own. Roz continued exploring the gravesite until a playful little ocean wave washed over the rocks. She automatically stepped away from it. Then a bigger wave sloshed towards her and she stepped away again. Then a gigantic wave crashed over the rocks and engulfed the entire gravesite. Heavy water pounded against her body and knocked her to the ground. And her damage sensors flared for the first time. A moment later, the wave was gone, and Roz lay there, dripping and dented and surrounded by dead robots. Roz could feel her survival instincts, the part of her computer brain that made her want to avoid danger and take care of herself so she could continue functioning properly. Her instincts were urging her to move away from the ocean. She carefully got to her feet and saw that high above the shore, the land was bursting with trees and grasses and flowers. It looked lush and safe up there. It looked like a much better place for our robot. She had just one problem. To get up there, she would have to climb the sea cliffs. Chapter 6. The Climb. Crack, thunk, clang. Roz was having a little trouble climbing the cliffs. She had a new dent on her rear and a long scrape down her side, and she was just about to get another ding when a crab scuttled out from under a piece of driftwood. The crab looked up and immediately showed off its giant claws. Everyone was afraid of his claws, but not the robot. She just looked down and introduced herself. "Hello, crab. My name is Roz." After a brief standoff, the crab cautiously backed away. And that's when Roz noticed how easily he moved over the rocks. With his wide stance and grippy feet, the crab could crawl up and down any rock face. So Roz decided to try out his climbing technique. She spread her arms wide and clamped each of her hands onto the cliffside. She jammed one foot into a crack and lifted her other foot onto a narrow ledge. And just like that, she was climbing. Roz moved awkwardly at first. A chunk of rock crumbled in her hand and she had trouble finding footholds. But as she climbed higher and higher, she started to get the hang of it. Seagulls squawked from their cliff nests and soared away when the robot came too close. Roz paid them no mind. She was focused only on getting to the top. Up and up and up she went, methodically climbing past nests and ledges and tiny trees rooted in the cracks, and before long our robot felt the safe, soft soil of the island beneath her feet. Chapter 7. The Wilderness. Animal sounds filled the forest. Chirps and wing beats and rustlings in the underbrush. And then from the sea cliffs there came new sounds, heavy, crunching footsteps. The forest animals all fell silent, and from their hiding places they watched as the sparkling monster stomped past. But the forest was not a comfortable place for Roz. Jagged rocks and fallen trees and tangled underbrush made it difficult for her to walk. She stumbled along, struggling to keep her balance, until her foot snagged and she toppled over like a piece of timber. It wasn't a bad fall. No dings, no dents, just dirt. But Roz was programmed to keep herself in good working order, and once she was back on her feet, she immediately began cleaning herself off. Her hands darted around her body, quickly brushing and picking off every speck of dirt. Only when the robot was sparkling clean again did she continue through the forest. Roz stumbled on until she found a patch of ground that was flat and open and carpeted with pine needles. It seemed like a safe place, and safety was all the robot really wanted. So she stood there, motionless, all perfect lines and angles set against the irregular shapes of the wilderness. Chapter 8. The Pine Cones. If you stand in a forest long enough, eventually something will fall on you. And Roz had been standing in the forest for long enough. A gentle wind whispered through the treetops, and then thunk. A pine cone bounced off her head. The robot looked down and watched the pine cone roll to a stop. It seemed harmless, so Roz went right back to doing nothing. A few hours later, a gust of wind rushed through the treetops, and then thunk. The robot looked down as another pine cone rolled away. And then a few hours after that, a howling wind tore through the treetops. It bent trunks and shook branches, and then thunk, thunk, thunk. Pine cones began raining down. Thunk, thunk. Roz felt something like annoyance. Thunk. She quickly scanned the area for somewhere safe from pine cones, and she spotted the perfect place when she looked up at the huge rocky shape that towered above the forest. Chapter 9. The Mountain. Roz was now stomping her way up the mountain. Dense forest and rocky outcrops forced the robot to zig and zag and backtrack, but after an hour of steady hiking, she arrived at the craggy mountain peak. Grasses and flowers and shrubs sprouted from every pocket of soil, but there were no trees at the top. Roz was safe from those annoying pine cones. She dusted herself off and then carefully climbed up a leaning slab of stone to the very highest point on the entire mountain. The robot slowly turned her head completely around. She saw the ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction. And at that moment, Roz learned what you and I have known from the beginning. In that moment, Roz finally realised that she was on an island. Roz looked down and surveyed the island. Starting from the sandy southern point, the island grew wider and greener and hillier until it finally jutted up into the rocky cone of the mountain. In some places, the mountain fell away, leaving sheer cliffs. A waterfall rushed off one cliff and fed a river that wound its way through a great meadow in the centre of the island. The river flowed past wildflowers and ponds and boulders and then disappeared into the forest. Blurry shapes suddenly cut through the robot's vision. She refocused her eyes and saw vultures circling above the foothills. Then she noticed lizards warming themselves on a distant rock. A badger peeked out from a berry bush. A moose waded through the stream. A flock of sparrows turned in perfect unison above the trees. The island was teeming with life. And now it had a new kind of life, a strange kind of life, artificial life. Chapter 10, The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz had no idea how she came to be on the island. She didn't know she'd been built in a factory and then stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean on a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating in the waves until it finally washed ashore. She didn't know she'd been accidentally activated by one of those curious sea otters. As the robot looked out at the island, it never occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. It was a different sort of book. Let's summarise. If I put up my 4 fingers, can you fill in the separate categories? Have a go. How did you find doing it without the headings? Let's see if we got similar things. Main character is Roz. She's on an island. The main problem is that her cargo ship sinks and she's the only robot to survive and be washed up on this island. As a result of this, she has to learn how to survive and adapt. Did you get something like that? I'm sure we'll all have slightly different things, and it doesn't matter as long as you've got the gist. How does Roz learn what everything is on the island? When she arrives, she's like a blank slate. She boots up and she notices something beaming down on her. She doesn't know what it is. Her computer brain identifies the sun, a bit like Google Lens, when you point the lens at something and it will identify what it is, like a plant. And so at first we see that process taking place. She says, "What is that?" Her computer brain goes to work, we're told, and identifies it's the sun. But from that point on, we're not told that. We just see her addressing the otters and the crab, and we understand that her computer brain is figuring that stuff out. How else is Roz learning? What other ways does she learn? Do you remember how she learns to climb the rocks? She observes the crab, doesn't she? How he spreads out his limbs and clings on with his claws. What about when she's under the trees? She learns through experience of the pine cones falling on her head. That's not a good place to stand, exactly. And she goes up the mountain looking for a place without trees. So we can see all the different ways that she's learning about her environment. Did you notice that today we read 10 chapters instead of the usual 1 or 2? Did you notice how short those chapters were? What is it like for us as the reader to be given a short chapter and then stop and refocus and have another short chapter, and then stop and refocus and have another short chapter. I felt that perhaps what the narrator was doing was allowing us to experience the story in the way that Roz is experiencing her new world, in these short, easily digestible snapshots, allowing us to process it in that way and bringing us closer to Roz by doing that. I do think it leads in to my next question. Why does the narrator keep referring to us, a reader, our robot? Why do you think that the narrator brings us in that way? What's the effect of someone saying our robot rather than my robot or the robot? It's like we own this robot. We are part of this robot story. Why should the narrator want to make us part of this? Why should the narrator want us to feel that Roz is our robot? Why do you think? If something's ours, we are more likely to care about it and be vested in it. And after all, what is Roz? She's a robot. So it's ensuring that we care about this hunk of metal with a computer brain. Why else might Roz be our robot? As the reader, what have we seen? We've seen her arrive, we've seen her be born, we've seen her take her first steps, say her first words, figure out her first problems. We've seen her from the very beginning. We have read her into being. As we read more about Roz, we read her into existence, and so she's ours. Did you notice anything particular about the language in the story so far? Even when I first began reading and was describing the storm, did you get the sense of the storm? How did you get the sense of the storm? One of the things that this writer does a lot, I've noticed, is link words with the conjunction and listen to the effect of that. Our story begins on the ocean with wind and rain and thunder and lightning and waves. You sense this storm building, this crescendo it's reaching, and then listen to how these crates are smashed against the rocks. But as the hurricane thrashed and swirled and knocked them around, do you feel the movement in that? The crates also began sinking into the depths. You feel the rhythm in the language of what's happening in the story. The language and the rhythm is exemplifying what's going on. It's incredibly clever. And he does that again when Roz is noticing trees and grass and pine cones. It's almost like we see her eyes snapshotting these things. It's very interesting, very different, and it really struck me. Did you notice anything else about this style of writing? What struck you? My question for you today is, how do you feel about living in a world with humanoid robots? It's a real possibility within the next 5 years. What would it be like to live in a world where there was a robot that you could interact with? How would you feel about it? Grab a parrot, a pet or a toy and have a chat. That's it for today, but I'll see you tomorrow for day 14 of our Story Advent Calendar. Goodbye for now.